Today, on episode number 563 of the Teaching in Higher Ed podcast, Defy, the Power of Saying No in a World that Demands Yes, with Dr. Sunita Sah.
Produced by Innovate Learning, maximizing human potential.
Welcome to this episode of Teaching in Higher Ed. I'm Bonnie Stahoviak, and this is the space where we explore the art and science of being more effective at facilitating learning. We also share ways to improve our productivity approaches so we can have more peace in our lives and be even more present for our students. It's with joy and excitement that I welcome to the show Dr. Sunita Sah. She's an award-winning professor at Cornell University and an expert in organizational psychology. Dr. Sah leads groundbreaking research on influence, authority, compliance, and defiance. A trained physician, she practiced medicine in the United Kingdom and worked as a management consultant for the pharmaceutical industry. She currently teaches executives, leaders, and students in healthcare and business. Dr. Sah is a sought-after international speaker and consultant, advisor to government agencies, and former commissioner of the National Commission on Forensic Science. Her multidisciplinary research and analyses have been widely published in leading academic journals and media entities, including the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Harvard Business Review, and Scientific American. Dr. Sunita Sah, welcome to Teaching in Higher Ed.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
I have been having a conversation with you in my mind ever since I first became familiar with your work. And I just want to start out today's conversation saying thank you, thank you. I thank you from me in the present, but also from all the people that are going to discover your work and how vital it is for us in our lives. I'd like to start with a question, which is, we're speaking mostly to people who are in higher education. Why is it so hard for us to say no? And how much of that is unique to potentially our context, what may be unique characteristics? But of course, I know some of this is just universally being human. Why is it so hard to say no?
I think you're right. It is part of being universally human for many people because of the way that we were brought up, right? We were socialized to be compliant from a very young age. At least I was, right? I was a child. I was known for being an obedient daughter and a student. But I've also worked in two areas. Medicine was my first career, mainly due to expectations and following those expectations. I worked as a physician in the UK. And then I transitioned later on to academia. And both of those professions, medicine and academia, I would say are very hierarchical and very much require huge amounts of compliance, or that's the expectation, especially from some rather than others. So I think the context is definitely important, but there's also a very important aspect of the way that we were socialized growing up.
As you were sharing that story, I was thinking about my own path to pursuing tenure at my institution. And my first couple of years, I distinctly remember, you will be in the faculty meeting and you will say nothing. You will walk in and you will put your head down. And if controversial things start, you say nothing. That you don't get to say anything until you have tenure. And that was really ingrained in me. And then when I've shared, I work at a very small university. So when I talk to other people at research institutions, they very lovingly tease me and say, oh, you don't even understand the politics behind. And I would be so confused where they would say, essentially, they'd have to say that they were leaving in advance and secure a job somewhere else before they could ever get, it was just the weirdest set of sort of setting yourself up to comply, although not in 100% of those cases, because part of that might be an act of defiance to go find another job somewhere else so you can keep the one that you have. But yeah, I just think about all the ways in which our culture can affect us in the present. But you started to talk about yourself as a little girl. Tell us a little bit more about even your very name and what it said to you about what it means to be a little girl and what it means to be good.
Yeah. So, as I said, that I remember asking my dad at one point when I was quite young, what does my name Sunita mean? And he told me in Sanskrit, Sunita means good. And that's what I mostly lived up to. I did what I was told. I went to school on time. I did all my homework as expected. And I even had my hair cut the way my parents insisted. And I remember that so much because I wanted a different hairstyle, but they insisted on particular things and I followed that. And these were the messages that I received, not just from my parents, but from the teachers and from community. Was like to be good was to fit in, to obey, to be polite, not make a scene, not question authority. And we often teach children these messages. We're often expected to comply. And that's what I thought. I believed or became to believe that being compliant meant being good and being defiant equated to being bad. And that was the moral equation that I received growing up for many, many years.
You and I both shared in that our mothers were somewhat we were accustomed to seeing them mostly being compliant as we were growing up. Although you have a pivotal memory, I'm going to have you share in just a moment about seeing your mother in a different light. I just wanted to quickly share about mine. And as I was reading your story, I started thinking about the musical and getting actually to go see it in on stage. The Sound of Music. And there's a piece of music where Julie Andrews in the movie sings, I must have done something good. And it's all about like how she got into this relationship. And the only reason why she must have gotten in there was because she did something good. And I remember my mom being uncharacteristically angry about that and wanting to break down that model. No, you're not in a relationship because you're lucky and you did something good. Like somehow you're subservient or beneath this person. And I've thought about that so much because the musical has meant so much to me. But every time that song comes on, I always think, thank you, Mom, for helping me read more carefully the lyrics that are being said and sung and what that could potentially shape in terms of our potential romantic relationships. And you've got such a wonderful story about your mom and you seeing her in such an uncharacteristic light and you being able to carry that forward. Talk about the trip back home.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, I have to say that's it's a fascinating story about your mother that you relay there because, it's these kind of statements or these kind of actions that you see from your parents that they might not even register, they might not even remember, and yet it really stays with you as a child and they remember your words. I often find that with my students as well. I say something and then they come back to me with what I've said. So a few years later, that's really stayed with them. And I think, oh, wow, that was quite profound. Did I really say that? I wish I could remember it for myself at times. But yes, the way I viewed my mother growing up, and even now to a certain extent, like at one point, I believed that compliance and defiance were two binary things, two opposite binary things. Now I've come to understand a lot more about compliance and defiance, and I talk about it a series of stages. But at that time, believing it was binary, I'd very much put my mother into the compliant box. She did all the cooking, the cleaning, the grocery shopping. She looked after the whole family, all of our needs. I saw her as very subservient, very kind, very generous person, and willing to help anyone, and never saw her raise her voice or be defiant in any way, or what we imagine what defiance might look like. And then one day I was walking back, I was about 7 or 8, and I was walking back from the grocery store with her, and she was wheeling along our rickety shopping cart, which is just like it looks like wheeled luggage that you take to the airport, two small wheels, and we were wheeling it home. And it's actually a long walk back home from the grocery store. And so we had a discussion as to whether to take a shortcut through what they call in Yorkshire a snicket, which is just a narrow alleyway. So I always got told when I was young not to go through the snicket because it might be dangerous and, it's a narrow alleyway. But I was with my mum, so we decided to go through the snicket. And in that snicket, we were stopped by a group of teenage boys. And they blocked our path and started shouting out some obnoxious things to us and telling us to go back home. Now, my mom was there. She was wearing her blue sari. She's petite, about 4'10" at the most. And she had her hair sort of plaited back, one single braid. And my reaction to those boys was instant. So I grabbed her arm and I looked away from the boys. I averted my gaze and I just wanted to maneuver as fast as possible through them so we could get home. And I kind of clung on to my mum. And she, though, stopped and she looked at the boys and she just said, "What do you mean?" And she wasn't particularly loud or anything. And the boys didn't say anything. They just kind of looked back, started looking at each other. I was panicking. My heart rate was going up. And so I grabbed her arm even tighter and I whispered to her, "Come on, Ma." And then she said no to me and she shook off my hand, which really surprised me. I was like, "Mom." And then she put the shopping cart up vertical and she put one hand on her hip and she looked back at the boys directly in their eyes. And she was saying, "No, what do you mean?" And they still didn't say anything. So there was a silence. And then she said, "Oh, you think you're big, strong, tough boys, right? Really clever, really clever." And the boys just were looking at each other. And then one of them said, "Let's go." And they just dispersed. And my mum grabbed the shopping cart and then she walked really fast through the rest of the alleyway to get home. And I was like, stood there frozen for a while and then ran to catch up with her. And I thought, what just happened there? It was so beyond what I had imagined her to be that it just really struck me. And what this really taught me was that a couple of things. First of all, defiance isn't a personality. It's not about being loud and brash and being a certain way, and either you are defiant or you're not defiant. It's a skill set. So we can choose to utilize it or not. And my mum must have encountered those boys or people like those boys before, and she must have thought about what she would do, especially in front of her daughter. And so even if compliance has been your default, like it has been for me, and very much so, I believe, for my mum growing up, then, and even in her adult life, it's not our destiny. So defiance is a practice, not a personality. So it's something that we really need to take home. And that's really powerful for us. If we see ourselves or have a self-concept that we're compliant, which I did for many, many years, and maybe to a certain extent still do, we can view defiance as a skill, one that's available and necessary for all of us to use. And that's the aim with my book, is to make defiance accessible to everyone.
As you share about that story with your mother, the other thing that when I think back to reading your book and also hearing you share the story today is, yes, it's a practice, it's a set of skills, but it also can look different depending on who we are. And it sounds like she was able to use her unique strengths and her unique positionality in that particular situation to draw back, and away from the boys who were attempting to subjugate the two of you in some way, to bring back some of that in her own unique way. There was something that was so fascinating to me as I read, and I feel like I maybe need, because it's something that I struggle with and I'm yearning to grow in. You talk about it as a practice. And that's something that, by the way, Peter Felton, when he was on the show, he talked about this also with curiosity. We tend to think of curiosity as you either have it or you don't, and that curiosity is a practice. So we think about, sometimes we'll get a little sassy with our students and say, "Oh, students today, they're not curious about things." Well, what if we were part of planting some seeds for curiosity? So I was thinking about that same idea as you wrote about, that we could practice our ability to defy. And yet you also talk about, we're pretty bad as human beings at knowing how we would be in a certain situation. And I thought in myself, both of those things can be true. And both of those things are true. I believe in both of those things, but maybe you could help me bring together some ways in my mind to help them become more true. So it's, yes, it's a practice. And yes, I'm also, as a human being, going to be pretty bad at knowing if I was in this terrible crisis of a situation, how I would do. And it's so easy to judge other people and how they chose to respond. So I don't know if that's I hope the worst question I'm going to ask you, because I'm really,
but no, it's a fantastic question. It's a really wonderful question, because that's what we grapple with, right? So many of us grapple with how to be defiant and being caught in that moment of crisis.
Yes.
And I do talk about, we find it very difficult to predict how we will react in a particular situation. And that's because I've learned that, so for many of us, the distance between who we think we are and what we actually do is enormous. Like, we think that we will enact our values, and there's a lot of research along these lines. So one study by Woodsicker and LaFrance asked a group of women, sort of students, if you were applying for a job as a research assistant and you got asked a series of questions such as, do you have a boyfriend? Do people find you desirable? Do you think it's important for women to wear bras at work? These are offensive questions. What the women said was that they would be angry at these questions and they would walk out. But when they actually conducted this experiment with a different set of women, but from the same population, similar demographics, they didn't walk out at all. And the emotion that they reported was feeling fear, not anger, but fear. And some of them even smiled uncomfortably. And I talk about my crocodile smile, which is a sort of instinctive thing that I do in situations when I feel very uncomfortable, is like I start to smile because you want to try and appease the other person. And it's actually when I feel uncomfortable. And so I had a colleague that once called it a crocodile smile. And I was like, yeah, you're right. That's exactly what it is, right? This instinctive small smile when we're put into difficult situations. So then the question becomes, how do we learn to practice defiance so we can actually react appropriately, the way that we want, the way that we aspire to, the way that we might predict if we think about our aspirational selves once we're in the moment? And that practice requires doing so long before the moment of crisis. So we're practicing in advance. And some of the things we can actually predict well. So some of the things that we need to defy are probably things that we've experienced before. So perhaps my mum had experienced those teenage boys in the alleyway before and not said anything at all. And this is the thing that we forget. We remember those great moments in history where somebody defied, and then we think it's a personality and that we couldn't do that. So we remember being taught about Rosa Parks and her famous no on the bus. But how many times had she complied before the famous no with segregation laws? This is what we have to remember, that a lot of us are compliant. And I think Rosa Parks also had said, when I read her autobiography, that she even agreed to be secretary once in this association because she was too timid to say no, right? So we don't visualize Rosa Parks as being timid. But that day she had practiced to say no on the bus. It wasn't spontaneous like some people think. And so, for example, in the workplace, that we might know that we have to be defiant in a particular situation, that there's going to be somebody in a faculty meeting that's going to say something inappropriate, or they're going to evaluate a job applicant in a way that's not to what the criteria are. Like, what do? We can often predict that because we've seen that person do it many times before, or we just know this is what happens. And previously, we might not have spoken up. Maybe pre-tenure, we did not speak up, but I got the same advice as you got, like keep your head down. So it's difficult, but once you can anticipate the most common situations that arise and think about them, then you can start to visualize it, and then you can start scripting. What is it I wish I had said? How could I have done that better? How could I have handled that situation? And then we can start role playing, because it's that practice of sort of saying the words out loud that change the neural pathways in our brain. So if we are wired to comply, which is the term that I use, if we are socialized to be compliant and we've been using that, oh, sorry, and going along, not saying anything, those neural pathways are really strong. The only way to change it is to start practicing sort of that defiance and practicing it over and over. And it doesn't have to be anything sort of loud or aggressive, which often comes out if we've been restraining ourselves for a long time. we want to sort of think about, maybe we can just say in that faculty meeting, what do you mean by that? The way my mum did, what do you mean by that? Can you clarify that for me? Oh, shouldn't we go along with this criteria? Have you considered this? There's ways of clarifying, and we could use the word challenging, but it's not confrontation. I would say curiosity rather than confrontation. Yeah.
Mm. At the risk of, I don't want to certainly make this part about me, but I resonated so much when you started talking about in a medical context. And to be clear for listeners, you worked as a physician in the United Kingdom. I never have worked as a physician, but I have some level of what I could best describe as trauma. And so it was really remarkable to me when I have what they call white coat syndrome is the casual way of phrasing it. But for listeners, that would be that my blood pressure, if I'm being measured in the office, it's just going to be off the charts. And that's always been the case. And when I've tested it at home, it's not been an issue previously. And someone once told me, like, you could just tell them that you don't want to take and it was literally revelatory, like, wait, you're allowed to do that? You could actually tell them, no, you could say no. And the other thing for me is weighing. I don't like to be weighed. And to date, this is in early 2025 when we're having this conversation. I haven't done this yet, but I desire to go, no, I weigh myself at home. And if you'd like me to let you know what that amount is, but like, why do we need to comply with the actual act of being weighed in the office? What difference would it make? But this all feels, I'm literally sweating just talking to you about it, but you have a story of your own, and yours is so different than mine because you had the knowledge that, of some medical background. So tell us about your little medical visit so I can stop getting all nervous over here.
No, so many people tell me about their medical experiences because it is an environment. There's so many things going on. Like, so first of all, you're often there and you're worried about your health, right? Or you're having an annual checkup. Maybe you think everything's fine, but you're always maybe a little bit worried that some things that are going to go wrong. And you want, like, doctors are supposed to be so trustworthy, but some medical environments, you're expected to be the compliant patient, even though now there's been a big movement for many years for the patient to make informed decision-making, shared decision-making with the physician. And for patients, there was a whole initiative to choose wisely. How can we choose wisely when the dynamic is set up in such a way that you have to come in before you even see the doctor? There's a series of things that happen that are different by country, but still it takes away your agency in a lot of these things. And sometimes, you're in your bedclothes or you're wearing a gown. And this, again, I remember from when I was working as a physician, some of the comments people make, oh, we see these people in their bedclothes and we don't realize, like, they have important jobs outside. And I remember thinking, well, why not? Why didn't you realize that, they're humans at the end of the day? But having had that full knowledge when I moved from the UK to the US, and one of my first experiences was when I had some really sort of central chest pain. And it was kind of crushing, which is of the pain that people describe when they're having a heart attack. So I was immediately worried, and I went to the emergency room, and immediately I was through triage. They was doing so many tests and also an electrocardiogram, and they ruled out that there was anything wrong with the heart. So I was relieved, and the pain was actually going away. So I was like, okay, that's great. And I thought I was going to be discharged. But then before I went, the doctor just said to me, oh, I want you to have a CT scan before we discharge you. And I was like, why? And she said, oh, we want to make sure you don't have a pulmonary embolism. And a pulmonary embolism, or what you call a PE, is just a blood clot in the lungs. And it can be quite dangerous, but it creates a specific type of pain, which catches your breath when you breathe in and you breathe out. It's kind of a very sharp pain. And I wasn't experiencing that kind of pain. So I did not think I had a pulmonary embolism at all. And my pain was going away. And I know that a CT scan exposes you to ionizing radiation about 70 times more than an X-ray, which still to some people isn't a large amount, but it can cause cancer later on in life. So why take the risk for something I knew I didn't have? And so I should have said no to that scan. And yet I was being too polite to tell the doctor I didn't want it. And so I ended up going along with something that I really regretted. And as I sort of sat there in the scanner with all the machinery going around me, I was like, why couldn't I have done more? Why couldn't I have said no? I had the knowledge, I had the understanding, I had all the elements required for informed consent, which is needed in medicine. And yet I went along with something that I really didn't want to. And if I found that so difficult to do, what must it be like for other people that don't have the knowledge and understanding in that situation? Because we put so much trust in our medical practitioners. And even when we feel that tension, oh, that doesn't sound quite right for me, we often just go along with it.
One thing that your work brings up in me is while we can sometimes be more self deprecating, where I can draw strength is when we are doing these acts on behalf of others. What does it look like in terms of our ability to defy when we think of it not in terms of our own needs, but of others?
Yeah, I call this the superpower of responsibility, in that one of the things that really enables our defiance is when we take responsibility for those actions. And it could be values or it could be for a loved one. Right? I find it so much easier to defy for my child than I do for myself. If I think something is going wrong in a medical situation with him, I find it so much easier to say, no, I want a second opinion. I want to understand this. And to really enact like what I would hope for myself and for other people could do when it's about somebody else. So we should use that. We should use that connection that we have with our values, that we taking when we take responsibility for ourselves and for others and our community, then we know what the right thing is to do. Like when I'm in that faculty meeting, I think about what's the harm being done to the people that are being discussed, then we can take responsibility that if I don't do anything here, this will perpetuate.
Would you walk us through what it looks like to plan in advance to defy? What are some of the things we might ask ourselves and some of the literal behaviors we might take on to do that planning in advance?
Sure. So after that x-ray, actually, I very much regretted what happened. And I was thinking, why did I go along with that when I believe in the principles of medical ethics, which is patient autonomy, the patient's right to choose, and do no harm, right? So I started thinking about that, and I started thinking about what I could have said. I could have just said, is this really necessary? I'm not comfortable with that. I prefer not to have that, right? There's so many things that you could say that are in alignment with my character, right? That's not going out of alignment with who I am. You don't need to be aggressive or violent, but just asking those questions. And why couldn't I do it? And I think I was also surprised a little bit because when I was in the UK, I used to ask questions if I was not happy with something. So I think I would ask, oh, there's not that much radiation, is there? Even though I know the answer. And I would hope that somebody else would pick up on it and then ask me whether I really want to do it or not. But in some contexts, nobody is going to do that. You have to do it for yourself, right? So nobody is going to ask you, are you really comfortable with that, which you kind of hope for. So you have to just bring it home, really. You have to work through what I call the 5 stages of defiance to be able to say no. And so what I did after that CT scan was really start thinking about what would happen the next time I'm in that situation, and what is it that I would have preferred to have said. So I started visualizing it, I started practicing it. And then about a year later, I was in a similar situation where I had some shoulder pain, and I knew it was going to be some kind of inflammation, and I wanted physical therapy. And then when I had a look at what I needed to go and get physical therapy, I needed to get a referral from a doctor. So I went to the doctor attached to my university's medical center. And as I walked in, I was put on a big sort of conveyor belt of, seeing lots of people, getting your blood pressure taken, getting weighed, all those things, right? It's like before you see the doctor, this is what's happening, do this, do that. And then I was back in the waiting room after all of that. They called my name again, and I was with like a technician or an assistant, and we were walking along, and I saw at the end of the corridor a big sign saying x-ray, and I kind of just laughed. Oh, it'd be so funny. In my head, I was thinking it'd be so funny if they took me for an x-ray before I started seeing the doctor. And then we started getting closer and closer to that. And then I said, where are we going? And she said, to get your x-ray. And I was like, but I haven't seen the doctor yet. Like, so the way that we are taught to practice medicine at medical school is that you see the patient, you take a history to understand what's going on, then you examine them to sort of look at the relevant, like, what do you find from examination? Only then, once you have your list of differential diagnosis, your list of different things that it could be, do you conduct investigations as to basically eliminate, right? And you only do that if it's going to change the clinical treatment of the patient. So you don't end up doing an excess of investigations or procedures, or that is how we were taught medicine. And so I was so surprised. So but I haven't seen the doctor yet. How could you possibly know I need an x-ray? And she said to me, all new patients have an x-ray before they see the doctor. And I was like, repeat it again, but I haven't seen the doctor yet because I was so stunned by this. And then she looked uncomfortable. And she said to me, are you refusing an x-ray? And I kind of stood there and I thought about the CT scan. And I just said, yes, until I see the doctor. And then she didn't know what to do. And she looked more uncomfortable than me. And she said, took me back to the waiting room. And she just said, sit there. And I sat there for a long time. And I did feel like some kind of, oh my goodness, I'm being the difficult patient. I'm not being compliant. I did have all those feelings, but I knew that this was not the right thing to do. And then I got called in to see some other assistants and technicians. They would open my file and each one would be no x-ray. It was really like a comedy at the end. And each time I was saying, no x-ray. And eventually I got to see the doctor, who also questioned no x-ray. And I said, yeah, but you haven't even examined me yet, at this point. And he gave me the quickest examination. It was almost like he didn't want to touch me. So, and then after that, he said, you need to have an x-ray. And I said, why? What's your differential diagnosis? And he was like, oh, I don't know. I want to see if something bony is going on. And I said, what? And he was like bone cancer. And I said, bone cancer? You think I have bone cancer? And he was like, oh, no, 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 no. And then he didn't know what to say. And then he's like, this is how we practice medicine here, and how it was more efficient. And that's how the clinic works. And he was basically telling me off. I ended up leaving with my physical therapy referral and no x-ray, and everything was fine. And I did end up writing about that experience like I was telling people, and they were like, oh, you should write about it. So I did write about it and actually ended up publishing it in JAMA Internal Medicine, and it got a really good response. So many physicians wrote to me, some to say, yes, we need to do it this way. And others like, yeah, this is a really bad aspect of for-profit medicine, is that I've even been asked by my medical center to conduct more tests, more scanning, so we can make more profit. And so it was really eye-opening. And so some small act of defiance that I did hopefully had like a ripple effect. Maybe it didn't change the physician's mind, my questioning, but if you do have the knowledge and the understanding, maybe if one other person asked, he might think a little bit more. And so that's what we hope for.
One of the tensions that your story uncovers for us, of course, is some of this is me projecting, but it's also in your work. But the idea that we wonder what they'll think about us. Are you the bad patient? That part is evident to many of us. The really surprising thing for me that I just hadn't contemplated as much until reading your book is there's a lot of research around that we're worried what they will think we think about them. So tell us about that. This was a whole dynamic that just blew my mind of how if someone's negotiating with us, I'm trying to remember the research study, and you'll know because it's your book.
Yes, I know what you mean. Yes.
That's just such a powerful example. Tell us about this whole another idea. We're not only worried about what they think about us, but also what they think we think about them.
About them, yes. So this is a psychological process that I call insinuation anxiety. And I'll come back to that term shortly. But let me describe an experience in another context that you might recognize. And when I describe these experiences, so many people can relate to it.
So much.
But this was actually my first job as a medical doctor in the UK, in Scotland, at the Western General Hospital. I was working very long hours from 8 o'clock in the morning. I was doing what you call a 1 in 2. So you would start work at 8 o'clock, you would work the whole day, the whole evening, the whole night. I would be on call, and then I'd finish the next day at 5. I would have that evening off and night to sleep, and then I would do the whole thing again. So that was a 1 in 2. It was like the kind of worst rotation. And so you're not doing anything in your life at that point apart from working and then trying to get sleep if you can. And so when I received this email to meet with a financial advisor for free at work, I was like, oh, well, that's something different. So I think I'll take up on that. I'll go and see this financial advisor since they're making the effort to come to my workplace. And I remember that meeting really well because it was in the posh meeting room at work, like as posh as you can get on the UK's National Health Service. And it had a carpet rather than cold stone tile walls, and it had a nice sofa. And I sort of sank down into that. And it was like, oh, this is so nice while I'm so tired. And then Dan, the financial advisor, when he came, he was really big, tall, handsome, big, so really nice, smart suit. And he greeted me with this big, warm smile. And he asked me many questions, mostly about my finances, which was surprising because I had an extremely limited disposable income at the time. And we spoke for about an hour, and he built up this amazing rapport with me. And at the end of an hour, he recommended that I invest in a couple of funds and that he was going to write a report for me and it would all get back to me in a few days. And all of this was for free. So I was really impressed. And I had to ask him, what's in it for you? And he said, well, there's no such thing as a free lunch, and that he would get paid commission if I invested in the funds that he was recommending. And so he disclosed this conflict of interest, and that immediately did hit home. I understood what he was saying, and I felt uncomfortable. I actually felt less trust in his advice, which is arguably the intended purpose of that kind of disclosure. Like, we're supposed to feel some uncertainty as quality advice and take it into consideration. But what happened is that I didn't want to signal that distrust to Dan. I didn't want him to know that I no longer trusted him because of what he had just revealed to me. I didn't want him to know that I thought he could be biased or incompetent or just that his advice was not right for me. It was very difficult. This is what I call insinuation anxiety, where you don't want to insinuate that the other person is untrustworthy, biased, corrupt, incompetent, unethical, or just not whom they appear to be or should be. It's a distinct type of anxiety that comes up when we start worrying that our non-compliance with another person's wishes or expectations is going to be interpreted as a signal of distrust. And then you risk offending them. Like, of course I wouldn't do that, right? And so what I found, it really is an aversive emotional state where you become so concerned with offending the other person, and these relationship concerns overtake what's right for you. And you can feel it in small situations where you're sort of sat on the hairdresser's chair and they're cutting and cutting, and you're like, I did ask for that, but not that. Why is she doing that? Why can I tell her to stop doing that? And she's saying, oh, this is going to look so good. This is going to look so good. Trust me. And she's going along with it. And I was like, and you're thinking, no, please stop. And it's so hard to tell them. And in my experiments that I've run in all different contexts, I've done some medical scenarios, but also looking at real behavior and offering people bad advice where it's very clear it's bad advice. Even in one-off situations, even with strangers, I see this insinuation anxiety, that we don't want to insinuate that a stranger or our advisors, co-workers, or friends are not trustworthy. So we need to think about that. It can happen in small stake situations, the hairdresser, large stake situations, medical scenarios, other ones, such as why co-pilots might not speak up to their pilots when they see an error. So one survey of over 1,700 crew members on commercial airlines found that 50% of them found it difficult to say something when they noticed a mistake. That's not what we want, right? So this insinuation anxiety can be very powerful.
This is the time in the show where we each get to share our recommendations. And I feel like our conversation just gets to continue because I want to recommend Defy, The Power of Saying No in a World That Demands Yes. It was such a gift to me personally, and I feel so much everyone that I have talked to about this book and in preparing to talk with you today and listening to some other interviews that you've done as well, every time someone hears the name of that book, they go, I need to have that book, and they want to write it down. And I just see it as such a gift to us in the world, and specifically to those of us that work in higher education. So much of that work comes so often from our values, deeply rooted. And you've given us so many tools and constructs to help us be able to defy using our own unique strengths and in our own unique constructs. And what I especially appreciate about it is because you're so vulnerable in sharing stories from your life where maybe you didn't defy the way that you would have today, that you might wish to. You give us permission to go, that's all right, that happened. And you released me from some of, I guess, my own feelings of shame and guilt around those times, and were equipping me throughout the read. I also want to recommend 2 other related things. So many people who've listened to the show for any time know that my husband, Dave, also has his own podcast. That's where I first heard about Sunita's work. And so I want to recommend Coaching for Leaders, episode 715, How to Stand Up for Yourself. What I already anticipated today's conversation would look so different from that one, because Dave and I have such different styles and approaches. And it certainly, every time I've heard you, I just get a different slice of it, being able to read your words and then also hear these conversations. So the last thing I wanted to recommend is a wonderful episode of the podcast Armchair Expert. And the episode is with your name, Sunita Sah, and then the subtitle is On Defiance. And these stories that you tell and the tools that you give us are so relatable. And this feeling like any of us could do this. We can do this. It's important work. And yeah, that's why I wanted to recommend those 3 things. And I will pass it over to you, Sunita, for whatever you would like to recommend.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And yes, I have to say both Dave on his podcast and Dax and Monica on their podcast, they were excellent hosts. So they always make me feel very comfortable. And it's always a fantastic conversation, as it has been with you too. And I do want to leave your listeners to sort of think about that sort of moral equation of defiance and compliance that we started with, and really start to think about, in these situations where we're not speaking up and it's actually harming ourselves or harming other people, we have to start wondering whether it's sometimes bad to be so good. There's a question we need to ask ourselves. What do we sacrifice by being so compliant? And I've spent decades now studying sort of influence, advice, and authority. And what I found that was really significant and really helped me and changed how I think is that we've misunderstood what it means to defy. And so I did come to a revelation that we need this new definition of defiance. And so the old definition is that to defy is to challenge the power of someone else boldly and openly. But my definition of defiance is that to defy is simply to act in accordance with your true values when there's pressure to do otherwise. And that makes defiance such a proactive, positive force in society, because everything we do every day, our decisions, our individual actions of consent and dissent, they create the society that we live in. And what I really wish for with my work and making defiance accessible to everyone is that the way that we raise our children is that we think less so about training them for compliance and more about training them for defiance when needed. Because what I would really like is, so one day, if you are stuck in an alleyway with your mother as a child, that one of the teenage boys would speak up and tell his peers to stop doing what they're doing because it's not right, so that my immigrant mother wouldn't have to do that. That's the type of society that I aspire for, and I think lots of people aspire for. And that's the hope with my work, is to make defiance accessible to everyone.
Dr. Sunita Sah, thank you so much for this generous conversation and for this incredible book.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to be here.
Dr. Sunita Sah, thank you for being the guest on today's episode of Teaching in Higher Ed and for your incredible book, Defy, the Power of Saying No in a World That Demands Yes. Thanks also to each one of you for listening to today's episode of Teaching in Higher Ed. Today's episode was produced by me, Bonnie Stahoviak. It was edited by the ever-talented Andrew Kroger. Podcast production support was provided by the amazing Sierra Priest. And if you've been listening for a while and haven't signed up for our weekly email, head over to teachinginhighered.com/subscribe. You'll receive an email in your inbox once a week with the most recent episodes, show notes, as well as some other resources that are unique to the update. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time on Teaching in Higher Ed.